Good afternoon. This is a work session on AO 2023-68, an ordinance establishing effectively an investment advisory commission. I would like members to please introduce themselves.
Karen Bronga.
Scott Myers.
Christopher Constant.
Anna Brawley.
Daniel Boland.
Also, we have,
Daniel Moore with Municipal Treasurer.
and on the phone,
Jim Voico is on the phone, and he's with RVK.
and Ross Risvold. Thank you, everybody. Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thank you. So the only reason I'm speaking is because we just transitioned from Budget and Finance Committee, where we heard the initial presentation of this ordinance. So anybody watching online now or in the future, please go back to the meeting that happened about an hour ago. But also, I have asked Mr. Moore, to not reiterate the content that we went through, but to really, again, emphasize for assembly members which of these pieces of this ordinance, AO 2023-68, are basically new or major policy changes versus, as we talked about in our last meeting, more conforming changes to existing code, so that we can focus our discussion. And then I also just want to emphasize, we have a wide variety of things that we take up. Sometimes it's things that assembly members have drafted. Sometimes it's things that come from other sources. And then sometimes things are very technical, right? Like this is a very technical thing, implementing something that the voters passed. And so, so again, just to frame the discussion as that we've gotten a lot of expert advice and a lot of work on this, which is not to say that it's correct or complete or should pass in its current form, but just reminding folks that this didn't happen in a vacuum. So with that, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right, thank you. And at the previous meeting, we had a brief discussion about the kind of outline of the project, and I think we got through the gist of that. So I think, Mr. Moore, I'm going to give you the floor with some leeway to take us how you want. I think there are a number of questions. Something this substantial, we have a practice where we might very likely go through it section by section and kind of read, but that might be better for committee work. But I understand there's some pressure of time, interest to get this done as soon as possible to get the body working and implement the will of the voters. So that said, between those two polls, taking all the time and rushing will land on the sweet spot. So you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'll just confirm that there was a tremendous amount of work done since last July. And so the section, the ordinance that you have before you, section 2 is essentially brand new language, but it's not language that we created out of thin air. And this is where we did a lot of research with Permanent Fund, Police and Fire Pension, RVK. And so the provisions you see under section 2 are ones that are brand new. However, you might notice here and there will be cross-references to other parts of the code. So like, for instance, the ethics code is cross-referenced. There's, other parts like that. So we want to show where there's linkage with existing standards in existing code, so that you can hopefully see what's new and then how it is further backfilled by existing code. One other sort of general comment here is that if something is not specifically stated here in this proposed ordinance as related to this new board, and there's other parts of the code that exist, those other parts of the code will govern. So it's sort of like what you have with a union contract. Whatever the union contract says is very specific, but if it's silent to certain provisions, then you look to the general municipal code, and that's the same thing here. So, and a lot of the practices, just in terms of the management of the fund, really aren't changing. So we still, even under treasurer as a sole fiduciary, there was always a lot of autonomous decision-making because if you're a named fiduciary, that sort of comes with the territory. And so our ability to select managers, advisors, et cetera, has always been autonomous. The only caveat is in the purchasing code, it does require when we select an investment advisor like RVK, that be done through an RFP process. So We used a firm called Callan Associates in the early years of the trust. And then we did an RF, and that was through an RFP. And then we did a more updated RFP about 7 years ago, and RVK was chosen to replace Callan. And so that's sort of the key in terms of selecting your managers, and everything kind of branches off from there. But we rely heavily on the investment consultant to monitor the performance, to help us determine prospective candidates, money manager candidates, and to just advise us on the strategy, the asset allocation. The investment consultant has a major role in advising the finance department and this new board on how things are going. So they're a major resource, and hopefully that helps a little bit.
Any questions? So I had one that's, and this is out of order in the timeline because it's later in the document. But if you go to page 8 of the ordinance, E5, which is line 35, what's the rationale for having effectively a budget after the beginning of the year?
Sure. So thanks, Mr. Chair. So for that, we do not receive all the final invoices from the money managers until about 3 months after the end of the year. And so what we try to do in that appropriation document is to let the assembly know what were the actual expenses in the prior year, so you have some real data. And then we say, here's what's proposed for the current year. And we always project that. We estimate a little bit high just because it's a not to exceed amount. And we also assume certain growth, like return with the various types of investment asset classes. So in order for us to pull that information together, it takes some time to have that information all available to us until we can present it to the assembly. If we did it like in November, like you do the normal budget process, we would be very much kind of in the dark in terms of what we need for the coming year. And so that's the rationale behind that.
So how do we budget for that then in November when we have to actually pass a budget?
Well, this is a direct expense appropriation. It's not part of the sort of the standard general government budget. And so it can be done at any time in the year is my understanding. And historically, we've always done it around that April time, March, April of each year. So that's, we're just following the past practice.
So the expenses of the finance team that does the investments don't get into the budget.
Correct. It's only things that are directly related to the management of the fund. And so any supporting costs, the CFO, the deputy treasurer, all those costs are part of the normal budget. But anything that's very specific to managing the money of the trust is a separate appropriation.
And did the funds for that management come out of the corpus?
Yeah, it's completely paid, and that's written into code. The trust fund is completely self-supporting. Yeah.
Right. So then it can detach from the budget cycle.
Correct.
It's not part of the levy. Okay. Other people with questions? Anna.
Yeah, and I know that we'll get into more of the content, but I have just a kind of a technical drafting question that may be helpful for others. So I'm looking at page 10 of the ordinance just as an example, and I was just curious why, because to me, it looks like the words and chief fiscal officer are the same. So, and then similar, there was one where it says assembly. So I just wondered, it's probably a question for Mr. Bowman, just what's up with that?
Through the chair, my understanding is, and Ross Griswold can weigh in, I think it's truly housekeeping and consistency in terms of, sentence case and all that kind of thing. So I don't think there's any substantive reason behind it other than it was an opportunity to be more consistent throughout. So,
yeah.
So it's capitalizing, is that?
That's the proposed way of doing it. Yeah. What's underlined.
I don't think the question came across. Maybe it wasn't quite answered. I don't think.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it really is the wording on the page, I guess. So looking at page 10, section A there, line 8, chief fiscal officer is being basically replaced. So I was just curious the difference between, is it capitalized chief fiscal officer? And then the thing that's, for drafting the removed language is that all caps and brackets. So was it lowercase? Or, I mean, it's not clear why those are different.
There's no change.
I don't have the existing code right in front of me, but the words are the same. It's just a question of whether it's lowercase or sentence case, is my understanding.
Mr. Bowman.
Through the chair, this section was partially also put together using the finance department to clean up some code stuff, some code portions. And to use the example you're looking at, 650.010, the first section is what it would now be subsection A. Previously was just a floating section without a subsection designation. And the words chief physical officer that would appear in the new subsection A, so line 7 there, is not capitalized in the current code. And so they're going through and capitalizing things and just doing some code cleanup for consistency's sake.
Mr. Gates.
Thanks. I just pulled up the code section. I agree with Mr. Bowman right now. It's all lowercase, and the changes just to make it a capital, like a proper title. And I just wanted to add, though, that for code drafting conventions, and there's guidelines that a lot of organizations publish nationwide, and I've learned that in general the guidelines usually say these things are lowercase, but there's a debate, I think, that arises regularly since the 1980s with our municipal code, and we see it variations all throughout the whole code, where titles like chief fiscal officer or director of something or department are capitalized or lowercase in different uses. So I think the key thing to do is with this ordinance to make it consistent throughout this ordinance. The code is volumes and volumes, and there's little inconsistency, but when you pass something, make it consistent throughout this document.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. And I know we have plenty of substance. I just wanted to get that one out of the way. So thank you.
Yeah, and just practically speaking, it makes the code drafting not communicate the way that it's done. And if I were trying to make it communicate, I would just change the letter. If we're just changing one letter, make it capital instead of lowercase, delete one letter, because then we would understand, because I had the same question and it's in a dozen places or more. So anyhow, just small details.
Mr. Chair, just the Jim Voico, who is online, I think he's got about 20 minutes and then he'll have to go to another meeting. So if there are particular questions about, the rationale, the policy, the pros and cons of certain framework decisions that were made, that would be helpful just while Jim's on the line. So.
Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess the question generally, did Mr. Voitko advise on the composition of the board? Because that's where my questions are. Okay. So what, and I guess I won't ask them all at once, but one question I have, I noticed a majority of the board is external to the municipality, which I appreciate. That seems valid. The ones that are internal members, I see they're not specified by department or role where the CFO is. And then I also know, there has been recently a tendency to appoint municipal employees to what I've always understood to be kind of, more advisory. But so I guess I would like the rationale of who those employees are, why they're not specified. I also understand not wanting to be too specific or too restrictive. Just curious about that.
I'll weigh in through chair just for a moment and see if Jim Voitko has anything more to add. We want to make sure there were enough internal voices on the board. The internal members are going to be subject to appointment by the assembly. They are also subject to the same appropriate background, knowledge, experience standards that we're going to be looking for, and that's also written in code. So we would likely pick individuals that, I'll just give an example. Ross Risvold's group has some very high level, very savvy, investment-oriented people. It could be someone from there that is able to serve. So I'll just stop there, but that's the plan. And we also want to make sure that the board has enough internal voice that it's not just municipal money being spoken for by an entire external group. So anyway, that's all. And I'll ask Jim Voitko if he wants to add to that.
No, I think that's perfect. The key thing that we were recommending strongly was that there be an independent majority on the board, that the CFO not be the permanent chair, not be the chair. And we simply didn't feel that we had the expertise to be highly specific about municipal employees that might go through the process, same process as Dan said, that would be suitable. We know who sat in the right function, and it may vary depending on their background. We thought that that was a degree of latitude that was left both to the administration and to the assembly. So I'll stop there.
So I have a question that is one of probably the more substantive ones that I'm going to bring in the conversation. And I haven't made a presupposition of where I'm going to land, but this is one that we have wrestled with over the years, and that's Section 4, subsection A, page 19, under the definitions, that effectively the way this is crafted, you've taken the assembly out of the project. We don't have an ability to set the proposed payout. Effectively, it's the board's decision, but you didn't want to come out and say that, I think, because that would be too aggressive of a move. But by saying that it has to have the concurrence of the board, effectively you are saying the assembly doesn't matter, the board gets what they want. And so, like I said, I haven't predisposed because I understand there are arguments on both sides of this, but I would like to hear from you and the team about why the assembly should give up that authority to direct the percentage of distribution that's allowed under the charter and the code for us to make that decision, to hand that final, very important decision to the board.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'll just say a couple comments, and I think Jim Voico probably can add. So part of what Jim presented before, he talked about intergenerational equity. And what that means is a current assembly, regardless of who's on the assembly, shouldn't sort of raid the till, so to speak, and sort of take out the maximum they can year to year, which is kind of a short-term view, and then leave the trust in a underwater situation or, you know, a recovery mode for years to come. So a great example was last year. Last year was horrific. Returns were double-digit negative. Inflation was terrible. The real return, which is the sum of those numbers, was like minus 18% or something. And so last year we actually paid out at 4%. The charter says you could pay it out at 5%. But just because you can doesn't mean you should. And the question is, who is in the best position to decide whether it's the most appropriate? And when we worked with our Investment Advisory Commission, we went through months of review of a lot of data, a lot of, you know, projections about future capital markets, et cetera, in order to come up with that recommendation of not to exceed 4.0%. Previously it was 4.5%. So because of the amount of sophistication, time, effort, knowledge that's put into reviewing that payout rate, in my view, the board is the best entity as a fiduciary to make that call. The assembly can still say, we want a budget at a certain level, a certain percentage. The mayor can say that. But ultimately, it really does need to have, in my opinion, have that final informed fiduciary, single person or board say we can go along with that, or we think we're getting ahead of ourselves. And it's all about long-term view and protecting the trust fund, the purchasing power of the trust fund. So I'll stop there, see if Jim has anything additional.
Well, I do. And I will say that the principle of intergenerational equity is best practice with the creation and the management of a perpetual endowment, perpetual public endowment. Indeed, in some states, as you may know, many of the Western states, because for land sales, oil royalties, coal royalties, and other things, there is sometimes even at the constitutional level, a requirement that the fiduciaries adhere to the principle of intergenerational equity, which I described earlier in your open session, that there be a careful balancing between the ability of future generations of citizens, future demographics, if you will, to benefit as equally relative to the current generation. And that's what makes a perpetual fund perpetual. So we would argue that this is best practice. And I will say that we do these calculations on a regular basis for places like the state of Washington, Texas, Mexico, Wyoming, and so on. And they're very complex. And as Dan said, the amount of payout in any given year can flex moderately up or down based on where, what the recent returns have been and what the prospective best estimate of returns can be. But this is what makes a perpetual fund perpetual and available not only to the current citizens, but to their children and grandchildren. So we would speak strongly in favor of exactly what is in the ordinance and what Dan said, that the board is in the best position to do this analysis and to try to make sure that for the municipality, this is truly a perpetual fund. So I'll stop there.
So just a couple of follow-ups to that. Are there other financial relationships within the municipality in which a third party is allowed the final say of a disbursement or an appropriation?
Through the chair, I would say the Police and Fire Pension Board would be a good example. There have been times where like the HR department has made some type of settlement, but the board actually has to concur with that in order to actually have the payout occur, because it has an impact on the financial strength of the pension fund. And so there are examples, but the key connection there is the pension fund is a fiduciary board, just like this new board is fiduciary board. Most of the other boards are advisory, they're kind of quasi, but they're not full-fledged fiduciary.
So now that is a very interesting board. I'm gonna kind of do a little history here because none of you were on when we had to wrestle with this, who are here in the room, that we had to restructure how we finance the police and fire compensation board. And it's a board that's established to fund the pensions before we went into PERS and TERS and had this new system that came up. And we have a liability for everyone who's still alive in that fund to pay out until the last person is not alive, or maybe even their last family member who's a beneficiary. And so it got in one time frame, I think it was in the mid-90s, early 90s, the board performed very well. And its board decided to make a major cash payout to its members. And just in time for effectively the market to go in a different direction. And all of a sudden, the municipality owed massive money that had to come from our treasury to pay back into that fund, which they paid cash payments out to, which was driven by a board fiduciary. And so I'm not confident that this is the best way to go. History teaches us many things. Now, Dan, last question. Last year, I think maybe it's 2 years ago now, there was a lot of pressure to increase the payout up to close to the 5%, right? Do you remember what happened?
Yes, I think there was a proposal to go higher. And at that time, I'd spoken sort of as a fiduciary in, I think, November. And then by March, we had presented a resolution from the Investment Commission recommending that you go no higher than 4%. And then I think talking to Dean Gates, I basically said, as a fiduciary, I literally in the final call. So I said, the mayor, the assembly, they can say, this is what we approved in the budget, this is what we want done. But if I don't execute it, I mean, I can choose not to execute it. And that's what I said, is I'm not going to pay out at a rate above 4% when I've been advised by RVK, by the commission, who are the most knowledgeable, that is the most prudent thing to do given market conditions. So,
And on your advice, what did the assembly do?
and the assembly definitely, thank you, as part of the revision, did come down to that amount. So that was very helpful.
And so I struggle with the giving away of our appropriating authority. And it's a question that we'll have conversations about probably as we get closer to the debates on the issue. But history tells us it could go the other way, even with the fiduciary, and a good appeal can win the day. And so advisory to that point is not necessarily a failed approach. Benjamin.
Through the chair. just on that lesson of history, right now we have a sole fiduciary, Dan. And the reason we're doing this change is the best practices we've been advised is that though that model has worked great for the municipality, it has rested on the shoulders of one individual. And we're being advised by RVK, by, if you look at the way these things are handled in other places, you do not rest this much responsibility on one shoulder. I am grateful that this assembly, the assembly, when we had that discussion about the 4 versus 5%, listened to the recommendations of Dan. But I'm your professional paranoiac.
Well,
so
I'll just say that I think that we heard and the voters agreed that that is the right way to go. And that's where we are. Now we're in the point of what are the details? Dancing with the devil. And so the devil's in the details. So thank you. Anyone have questions? More? No? Anna?
Yeah, and if Mr. Boyko's still there, so I understand it's a best practice. I guess I want to go further and ask, is Alaska or is Anchorage unusual in our current setup where it is the governing or, the legislative body who ultimately can decide that dividend question?
Are you there, Jim?
I'm sorry, I am here. I would defer as to who under your current governance has the final word on what a disbursement, an annual dividend would be. I would defer to Mr. Bowman, your attorney. But I will say that, once again, that the most common practice for perpetual public funds is to have, have measures that require intergenerational equity. Now, is it absolutely uniform? The answer is no. But as Dan pointed out, there is a risk. There simply is a risk that a current regime that happens within the elected essentially borrows from the next generation currently, and then the fund is no longer perpetual. Its ability to serve citizenry has been essentially permanently crimped. So the whole goal of intergenerational equity is to try not to do that. And again, it's a principle that we strongly recommend. And it's, as I understand, under your current situation, the sole fiduciary may have the final word. But again, I would defer to Attorney Bowman for that. I'll also say that the example of a pension and a compensation plan was raised. And I will say that there is a difference in most of in fact, pretty much all. I'm hard pressed to find a separate example where a pension board can change benefits without without legislative approval. That would be extremely rare. So I'm not sure that example is particularly relevant here. The real question here is, does the municipality want a true perpetual endowment that serves the current citizens, their children, their grandchildren, in a manner as close to equal as is humanly possible? So I'll stop there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that context, and I appreciate that you're not as familiar with our specifics. I guess I'll observe too on the point of essentially giving up some of our authority. It is clear that we are a young state, we're a young city, and that examples like this are where we're out of step with the way most other places have done things for longer than we've existed, maybe. And so I'm not suggesting that we should lightly give up that authority, but I guess I'm also I am swayed by the argument that that there are reasons that you take things out of the essentially elected or the potentially political sphere for the purposes of having a longer term view. So I appreciate that. There is a tension there, right? And it's hard for us to, as elected officials, to say let's give up that authority. So I think that is going to continue to be a tension.
And Chair, can I make one additional comment? And that is, it is one of the reasons for having municipal officials as part of the fiduciary body. Because they bring, there is this, again, strike this balance between the municipal view of the world currently, as well as the ability to look forward that independent members bring. So it's not as though that the current situation that the municipality is in will never be discussed. I mean, there will be 3 members of the municipality as fiduciaries on this board. So it's not that that point of view will not be present and accounted for. So
And, you know, the timing of this ordinance is coming at a time when maybe there is some repairing of relationships beginning, but it's at a historic low of trust between the 2 branches of government. And the only touch on this that the assembly, the legislative body has, is the appropriation and the confirmation of appointees. And after that, it's anybody else's game. They don't even really work for us when the executive decides that they don't. You can't have conversations with them. You can only have conversations with one person in a 3,000 member municipality in order to get any business done. So it's not the most persuasive argument, but I think the more persuasive argument, and like I said, I made a call on this. I'm one who wants to strongly protect the legislative power and the appropriating power of this body, is the legislature and the governor and the permanent fund and the political football that is a permanent fund that is subject to appropriation every year. And so, you know, that's probably the most clean and clear example of how you don't want to do it. And so in this small way, that's what this is, but we're talking about the difference of 1% or 2% on any given year, which is substantial to us, immaterial to them. So I'm still not sure where I'm at, but that's the question that this all so far raises to me.
And just through the chair, and this is probably a Dean Gates or Ben Bowman, but I think the legislative branch obviously can do the appropriation. The executive branch executes upon that. And if they're, in this case, a fiduciary board said, okay, you just appropriated 5% and the fiduciary board says 4%, the execution of that may be less than the 5% you appropriated because the board feels that that's in the best long-term interest of the fund. There is a conflict there, but I guess in the big picture, it's like, I see it as who is in the best position to know and to have studied the issue to then make a good recommendation. And that's really in the purview of the board and the investment consultant, more so than the assembly, which you have a lot of different issues in front of you all the time, and you don't have the expertise to just make that call. From a budget standpoint, I can say, yeah, if we go from this percentage to that percentage, it provides more money. That's just a calculation. But whether or not that's supported in terms of the long-term viability of the fund, you know, that's a real issue. And I can say after the Great Recession, 08, 09, it took us 7 or 8 years before we went from 4% to 4.25%. We had to allow the fund to rebuild. And so it's going to vary over time as the market circumstances change. And all we know is the most we could ever pay is 5%. And then currently it's 4%. So.
Last note before I'll hand it to someone else. And I'll just say that the other mitigating factor that argues for your point or your structure is that there is only one seat on that board that is by a political appointee that could be fired tomorrow because they didn't do what the king on the 8th floor wanted.
Right.
And so 1 out of 7 can't carry the day. They can be persuasive and have backdoor conversations. And that raises another question if no one else is in the queue. What is, and I haven't read it line by line yet, it's a lot. What is the standard for open meetings for this body?
I'll defer to Ben on that one. So.
Gotta dig through the chair. Please give me a moment. I'll pull up the open meeting section. But it's so I'm going to refer the body to page 7, starting at line 3, board operation and communication. The board is required to meet no, editorializing, not quoting. Board's required to meet no less than quarterly. All meetings are publicly noticed pursuant to standard municipal processes for public notice. This is actually slightly more restrictive requirements for when and how meetings can be held than typically is required of a 405 board. Mostly to make sure that board members are able to be there, members of the public are able to be there. And we have particularly designed that where this change, the specific board-specific code provision remains silent, we default to the 405 general provisions.
Can you cite the lines on that page 7?
7 lines 3 through 15. And then the default where if it's not specifically in this document, then it goes back to our standard 405 provisions is page 9, lines 18 through 20.
So for our council, I would ask you guys to look at those references and come back and be prepared to talk about how that operates in the context of meetings. There's a code site. I don't have it in my brain. Dean?
Well, and thank you, Mr. Bowman, for pointing out this section. It does refer to Chapter 125 and, the definition of announcement. In Chapter 125 in our code, it does refer to the Open Meetings Act statute and says it's not intended to diminish any requirements of the Open Meetings Act itself. I think you could connect the dots to say the Open Meetings Act applies, and it would generally be, though, just posting notice of the meetings, reasonable notice, according to those terms. I guess that would be my interpretation, but I also see it's in Title 4 of our code it's being added there, and Open Meetings Act defines, by its definitions, applies to boards of a municipal body. So,
There's a
I think
cognate
they're on the side
question.
of saying it applies.
And the cognate question is, what about open records? The state open records laws. How does that apply here? What records are subject to request? What records aren't? How does that operate? Because these have been the areas of tension of late.
That's a very different question. I defer to Mr. Bowman.
And an answer that I have to get back to you is a fine answer.
Yeah, and well, I will say, if I can get back to you, I will do so. But if this was intentionally designed that if it is not specifically called out in this code section, it's a default to our standard boards and commissions process, which as Council Gates cited, has open records, has open meetings, all of that's incorporated. And so we're trying to, we know that this is a little bit of an odd duck, but we're trying to keep it as standard as possible and utilize the formats and structures that we have already put together, the municipalities already put together, and that works.
Did we explicitly state in the language here that if it's not stated, then it defaults to the code?
Page 9, lines 18 through 20.
Okay, helpful. And if anyone wants to jump in, please. Anna.
Yeah, and this is staying on the topic of the board. So I'm looking at, because speaking of things that have come up recently, the question of quorum. So I see on I'm looking at page 6, and I see it says down by line 33, 4 members of the board shall constitute a quorum for transaction of business. That makes sense because we're talking about a 7-member board. So 4 is a majority, and then we're not getting into the issue of the seats. However, right here. Page 6, line 33, starting on line 33. But then going next page, page 7, and then looking at line starting at 18, the board shall also be selected by an affirmative majority vote of seated board members. So I wondered if this was a convenience, thinking about the first meetings where you may not have 7 members on this board. However, that seems to, one, conflict with the 4-member quorum requirement. And also, I guess I see, again, in the area of potential risk, if it is probably practical or easier to seat municipal employee members before independent members, again, in this initial cycle, just in terms of reviewing who's out there, right? Then does this basically mean, even though the CFO cannot be chair, that that the muni employees would be able to seat that chair before there's other voices on the board? I guess that's where I'm concerned.
Through the chair to Assemblyperson Brawley. Well, one, to have the 4-member quorum to even hold a meeting, they would necessarily have at least one external member. The total, they have to have one. And it's designed that way. Quorum was built so that external members could not be excluded. Ostensibly, you could run into a situation where a board chair could be appointed prior to filling all the external seats, but you could also run into a situation where we could only have external seats, but for the CFO. Remember, appointment is standard additional process, but then it goes through confirmation with the assembly. So we'll know who's all on the board. You all will all know who's on the board at any time.
I guess maybe to clarify, so because this one does seem to give a lower standard for quorum just for this action, and I totally appreciate that you need a chair in order to function as a body, right? But I'm wondering, I guess I'm just wondering, it seems like that is, it just conflicts with the other piece. I guess that's maybe the rub.
Through the chair, so you're looking at the challenge between subsection C11 and D3, D2.
Yes.
Whereby you could theoretically have a board chair. You could open a meeting with 4 members and then elect a board chair with 3 members. Is that the scenario you're talking about?
Well, I guess it just seems like if quorum is 4, then, but it's saying that you can act on an affirmative majority of a vote of seated board members. And I know it's probably something that was only going to come up when this board is first created, but it still seems like you can select a chair. I mean, if there's only 4 people, then I guess you would need 3 members to do that.
Yes, that is kind of the selection of the chair is the action the board could take in the situation where you have only seated 4 or 5 members. You could have quorum to hold a meeting and elect a chair with only 3 members. So that is an action the board could take with less than a majority of the board being 4 members. But it's only in that condition where you're missing 2 to 3 members, but not more than that, because if you're missing 4 members, you can't open a meeting.
Through Chair, I would say, just on the record, the intent from the finance department would be to work to fully seat this new board before it goes into operation. So we don't really want a partial board and then someone comes on months later and they're trying to catch up on things. So if that helps, that's what we intend to do. So.
And just real briefly, then it seems like it's still, it might be stronger to just hold it to the same standard, but I understand the practicality of, again, you got to form the board.
Ms. Braga.
So I was looking at on page 4, number 2. So I'm sorry, jumping around. I'm sorry. We've got the stipend of 300 and a max of 12 meetings. But then it says a board shall by uniform rule establish a policy for reimbursement for travel expenditures incurred by the board. And then I see, if we go to page 7 on E, it looks like they're talking about reimbursement of travel by the board chair. What stopgap is there that the meeting isn't called for Hawaii?
Through the chair to Ms. Braga. It's going to be up to a majority of the board to approve any type of expenses for training or travel in advance. The board chair is just there to review that the charges were in conformance with what the board authorized. So like if there's, and again, this is a good example, there's travel policy that exists for the city. And if it's silent, the board hasn't developed their own travel policy, then the city's one will prevail. And so like, you wouldn't fly first class or whatever. Some of these conferences, because they're conferences, they do choose desirable places. So, but it's really up to the board in terms of, is the conference going to be worthwhile, a good investment of trust monies, and whether or not I guess the content of the conference is something that they feel is needed for that board member. So I'm on the police and fire pension board, and they do this all the time in terms of asking the board, is it okay for this member to attend this particular conference? And it seems like it works out well because you literally have to take a vote on each particular matter. So hopefully that helps.
I think, though, that there are two different kinds of travel contemplated in that section there. One is for board meetings, and one is for all other expenses, which might be conferences. It doesn't speak to conferences here. And so I think your point is germane. Like, why in the world would the Anchorage Investment Advisory Board meet in Honolulu? But it could under this code.
Through the chair, I guess that might be possible, but there is an accountability aspect here, and we are a public fund, and so I think there would be a lot of criticism if that were to occur. So you hopefully try, but with the mix of external internal members, that is helpful to spawning opinions about is this going to be perceived? Is this a worthwhile thing we're doing? Is it necessary? So I think you do have to sort of trust in the collective judgment of that board. But if something gets out of line, that's, that can be called out and further discussed. So, yeah.
Yeah, so my next question is back on the point Anna made.
Before-
Go ahead, Mr. Bowman.
And I'd build off of that. Remember, we do have the standard removal process if these individuals are acting unethically, but they have the added obligation that not only do they have to act ethically under the municipal ethic codes, but they have to also act ethically as fiduciaries of these trust funds which they're expending. So if we have someone if the board goes rogue and decides that they really want to go to Tahiti, they'll have to defend why that is an appropriate expenditure of funds as a fiduciary or face removal under the removal provisions.
The removal provisions requires joint participation by both branches of government. Imagine the chair of the assembly decided they wanted to go to Tahiti with them, and so you couldn't actually achieve removal because the chair doesn't quite have unitary power. But you understand what I'm saying without trying to point too many fingers. And so it's interesting. It's a rabbit hole maybe, but it's worth contemplating the boundaries. I want to go back to the quorum question under page 6, line 33, that part there. What would you think? 4 members of the board shall constitute a quorum for transaction of business and shall have full power to act under the terms of the section. So we are having many conversations these days about the powers of boards and commissions and quorums and what it means to take action. And so is it fair for 3 members of a 7-member board to vote in the affirmative and carry a motion? And it's more extraordinary when you have a 9-member and 3 can actually carry a motion. But in this case, do you think that's really wise?
I'll have to defer to law and see, because I don't really have good perspective on that. So,
Just to make sure I'm understanding the question to the chair.
My read on this is that it's like kind of the standard provision that a majority of the quorum can make an affirmative decision. And we're moving the code slowly. We have 4 boards we just adjusted to say it's a majority of the seats, not the majority of those seated, but the majority of the seats, which means if you had a 9-member board and 5 members present, no one could vote against the motion in order for it to pass. You have to have 5 yes votes.
That's how this reads. The only provision that conflicts with that, as pointed out by Assemblyperson Brawley, is the appointment of the chair of the board. So you would need 4 members of the 7-member board to take action. For
4
this board.
members voting in the affirmative, not simply in the room.
Yes. Yeah, 4 members of the board constitutes quorum for the transaction of business, and 4 members of the board shall have full power to act under the terms of the section.
You agree, Dean and Matthew? Because that's how I believe it should be. I just don't know if that's how it reads.
That was our intent. If it
Yeah.
doesn't read that way, we'll modify.
For the quorum, 4 members could transact business in the meeting. But I think, and no, I haven't studied this document, and I think we had some ordinance talking about the voting, how to count votes for boards and commissions recently, and I'm not recalling exactly what that did, so it depends on those.
Matthew?
But under Robert's rules, if 4 can transact business, then it's a majority of the 4, so 3 gets a motion. But I think we just passed an ordinance that changed that for our code.
Only
Is that
for
right?
4, only for 4 commissions. Mr. Hurt, you want to speak to that as well?
Yes, sir. I would concur with Mr. Gates' kind of reading of that as well. When I first read it, that my impression was that a majority of the quorum would be able to transact business. I see Mr. Bowman's reading of it, but I'm not sure that the plain text of it really supports that.
We're entirely happy to shop that language. The intention from the Investment Advisory Committee, RVK, Finance, and Law was to have it be, you would need 4 votes in the affirmative to do whatever. That
Okay.
was the intent. So
Good, because that is definitely the way we're moving as a legislative body. And it's just going to take us a while to get there. But yeah, super minorities should not be conducting business on behalf of a body. Okay, how much more time do we have? Say again?
This is scheduled to 2:20 and the next work session is at 2:30.
Well then,
Mr. Chair, just before we run out of time, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. That was great. And for the extra time, I really do appreciate that. We would definitely like, if the assembly is ready, to try to deal with this at your next meeting. If there are not a lot of amendments, and so far I haven't heard of a bunch, I mean, a handful, that we can agree to, we concur with the different suggestions. We could do, with the law's help, some floor amendments. That might be the easiest way to go if we just have a limited number. But I will be retiring, so I won't be here past June. There's a lot of momentum, a lot of background work that's gone into this, and it is a very, specialized subject. So you almost, I mean, if you were to recognize all the players that have been contributing to this, it's really a question of, is there any final part that's confusing or inadequate? But I'm hoping we're really, really close to being in a position to approve it. If you were to delay, it'd be like there's really big, huge substantive issues that you need to continue to explore. But I'm hoping that's not the case. So anyway, I'll stop there. Thanks.
and I would offer that any delay would just be because it is substantive. It has huge ramifications, and there were 4.5 of us here that were participating in this conversation, and probably there are more questions that folks are going to need to be chewing on. But I have often been surprised by an assembly. You never know what's going to get 7 votes on any given Tuesday. And so I would say be cautious with your anticipation of finishing this by Tuesday, but it's possible.
Do you want us to go ahead and work with law on floor amendments to have
Sure.
those ready?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Then I guess we'll adjourn this work session and prepare for the next one.